So we've put together a new template. A lot of my templates are just a piece of cardboard, so this is for the affectionately named side piece. So when it's all finished, it looks like this. Just a nice little easy to use card holder. Holds, well, 10, 15 business cards or cards, so if you've only got 2 or 3 it holds those securely. So in here I've got some old business cards just that have been used for sizing. The risk is when you use a card template, which I don't have to hand here, that you end up with uneven stitching. This is the first prototype that I made, so you can see that where the leather is folded slightly off center. So I don't know if everybody else would see that as much, but I notice it quite a lot. It's ever so slightly higher here than it is down here, and the best way to avoid that is to create a digital pattern. So obviously we've got the nice Vintage Nights side piece. The reason that I put it together in this format is so that I can kind of hand it off to anybody and they could have a go at making it. We may or may not provide this for sale in the future, kind of waiting to see how things go with that. But yeah, so we'll get started, cutting the pattern out, tracing it onto the leather, and then we can get going. It's a really straightforward project. A lot of kind of beginner style wallets look like this. One of the reasons I'm slightly apprehensive to sell a pattern like this, primarily just because it's a really good starter project to look at a wallet like this when you're first starting leatherwork and think, how do I make that? I'll work it out myself. So that's one of the reasons that I'm apprehensive of selling a pattern like this, is because it's good to work it out for yourself, and if you are trying leatherwork, it's useful to try and work things out like that and say, right, I like this pattern, how have they made that? I'll make it myself. So you want it as close to the lines as you can possibly get. So there's only 2 pieces to this this wallet. It's a nice minimalistic piece. Keep it straightforward. One thing to bear in mind as well when you create a pattern like this is that the lines actually have a thickness. So it's not just as straightforward as, oh, I cut around it and then it's done. You need to be cautious of whether or not your lines are 1 millimeter thick or 2 millimeters thick, 1/2 mil thick, because that can all mess things up. So you can see just about on here that these stitching lines, once it's folded up, need to match perfectly along the bottom, and that's where that kind of issue comes in, because if you start this one on the outside of the line and then you start this one on the inside of the line, when it comes together they won't match up as they won't marry up as they should. Giving away all of the secrets. This is where the tricky bit gets in, because you can't rely on your ruler. You end up having to actually practice pulling curves if you're ever doing any work like this, the trick here is not to put your hand on the cutting mat. It's very much like painting and drawing, in that when you start out, you start by having your hand on the table and you pivot around your wrist or you pivot around your elbow. And actually, if you want a nice smooth curve, the way to do that is to draw from your shoulder. So you're pulling it with your body rather than pivoting, because when you pivot, eventually you run out of space to pivot with. But a bit of practice, I think it's a nice smooth curves. Okay, I'm just going to shave off some rough edges here. There we go. Some slightly off cuts around here. The benefit of working with leather as well is even if you do get something slightly off at this pattern cutting stage, as long as it's not too far off, you can fix it when you come to cut your leather pieces. As long as you always cut your leather pieces slightly larger, you can always remove leather, but you can't add leather. Not without changing the pattern anyway. Like I said, this is a really straightforward one, but it's great for a bit of personalisation. The strap or flap that goes along the front of here, you can stamp with business names, important dates, things if you want to remember, that kind of stuff. Okay, there's my pattern cut out. Let's put the guard back on the knife, move them all out of the way. So when working with your leather, it's also really important to check for gouges and imperfections on the back. So there's a slight seam here, which looks like where some part of the tanning process has gripped the leather or something like that. We've just scratched, but that actually won't cause any issues. You also want to watch out for things like this. This prototype was made with a really low quality part of the hide, so right on the edges here the hide gets stretched, so you can see all the loose fibres in there, but this one is just for me, so that doesn't bother me at all. Obviously when we're making our products for sale, everything comes from the really nice consistent parts of the hide, so you get a really nice product. Another thing I recommend is once you blade your pattern out, there's Brian, is just to take an awl. Working with leather that's attached to a large part of the hide can actually be a little bit of a pain. Just because anytime you want to change or move things and get a better angle to cut, you have to move the entire roll of leather, which you can just about see on the end. It's not the biggest hide in the world, so I like to take the awl and just roughly draw around the area that I need. Not keeping it exactly tight to the leather, but keeping it close enough that I can just cut that piece away and I'm going to have plenty of space. Hey Kiki. It's also important to start with a fresh blade on any product. I don't think you can see him in the background there. Brian is currently investigating everything that I've put away. We've got a lot of packaging arrived recently, which is more exciting than you'd think, receiving a ton of cardboard boxes and jiffy bags. But he thinks they're extremely interesting. So I'm just going to move the pattern off. I don't think the camera is quite good enough quality to pick up the line that I skive, but I'm just going to cut through around that. Again, I don't have to worry about this being exact because I know I left a centimetre or so around the outside. So when I pull this piece away, I'm now working with a much smaller piece and I know it fits my pattern. So I'll roll this up, keep that out of the way. And now for the slightly trickier bit. So there are lots of ways to do this. Some people like to tape their pattern down to the leather and then scribe around it, or tape it down and cut it out while it's taped. That's not the way that I learnt. So I like to scratch the pattern onto the face of the leather with the awl, which requires a little bit of being careful to make sure it doesn't move around. The beauty of this particular leather is that it's what's called a waxed pull-up. So these scratches, these are quite deep, but if I was to say run my fingernail across it, a lot of nicer leathers that would scrape it and damage it, and then it wouldn't be as good. But with wax pull-up, the scratches actually really add to the look of the piece. So usually you would have to carry around a wallet for years before it started to really look used and experienced, and gain what they call a patina, which I know is a term usually reserved for cooking, like your skillet in your kitchen may gain a patina over time. It's the same thing when it comes to like leather wallets, but these wax pull-up leathers actually get that almost immediately just by a little bit of use, because as you use it and move it, the finish of the dye sort of moves around, so it doesn't damage the leather at all, but it does look very nice. Hey Claire. So I'm not marking on any of my stitch lines or fold lines or anything at the moment because they will come at a later date. At the moment, it's just about getting the pieces cut exactly to shape. So this is quite a thick leather as well. This is designed to last for a long time. And it doesn't have many layers, so something like the quick draw wallet that we make, which is a pattern from Quarter Leather, which is an American company, and they make lovely patterns and great YouTube videos. Theirs is made from that one's made from multiple layers of a thinner leather, so we actually use a slightly fancier leather for it, but it ends up with about 4 layers of it with a reinforced core. And that makes it a little bit more long lasting. So that one looks, if you haven't seen it, looks like this. It's the one that I've been using. I've had this one for a little while, so it's gained a really nice patina. It's got a few marks on where the dog stole it. The one we make actually has a slightly modified pattern, so this thumb slot is a bit deeper, just to make life easy, because getting like the little bit of cash and cards I keep in there can be a little bit difficult sometimes. Okay. part of the reason it's so important to use a brand new blade is just for the quality of the cut that you get, because if you have to go over a line 5 or 6 times to get through the leather, you end up with these kind of little lines down the side where your knife hasn't been in exactly the same position, and it can just kind of ruin the finished look a little bit. Again, it's one of those things where you're not going to notice it unless you're looking for it. So this is our first Facebook Live. I'm looking to expand this onto Instagram and things like that, and we haven't really decided if we're gonna make this a regular thing. But as I've spent some time making this pattern, and I need to test it out, so it may not work, and that would be quite entertaining to watch. We are going to look at maybe making it a regular thing, so you could join us every lunchtime. Well, not every lunchtime, I definitely can't do it every single day, but maybe once or twice a week, especially when I'm making larger orders. I will just be kind of sat working away, and it would be lovely to kind of socialise a little bit. Okay, here's where the fun begins. You can tell I'm focused because I have stopped talking for 30 seconds. So this is what I was saying about having a nice sharp knife, is that I only have to do this twice rather than 6 times. Especially as when you come to cutting curves, it's very tempting to play it safe and only cut through half of the leather, because you don't want to ruin your curve. And really, it works against you. It's the same as in a kitchen. Sharp knife is a safe knife. So I don't have all the time in the world today, so there's no way I'm going to actually finish this on camera. But it's nice to stop in and get a bit of interaction, or just, you know, talk incessantly at you for 25 minutes, half an hour. Okay, it's looking good. So far, this all lines up nicely. Okay, so I'm turning it over onto the face of the hide, and this is where I will actually mark some lines. So I'll drop this back on top. Just make sure it's in line. And I don't actually need too many markings. I just need to make sure that the markings, that the pattern is aligned and the markings on this side and this side are the same. So I'm going to mark here, I'm going to mark here, 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 and here. So these are tiny little awl marks that you're not going to be able to see on there. And the reason we do that is so that I can set up my wing dividers and make sure I get my lines nice and straight. Okay. Actually, thinking about it, I probably want these marked on the face of the leather rather than the back. Yeah, I want to punch through from this side, that makes more sense. So I'm going to do those markings again. There. 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 It's more for distance than anything else. For the distance that the wing dividers need to travel. So I know, because obviously I made the pattern, these are 4mm away from the edge. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. I can line it up with the dotted lines on the pattern, or I can line it up with my ruler and make sure that these are 4cm apart. Then I'm just going from hole to hole, and from hole over the edge, and the same on the other side. we go. And then next, so something we want to make sure doesn't happen is threads can stand up off the face of the leather. And if that happens, then over time it gets rubbed and it gets worn, and the wax that you put on the thread comes off, and eventually the threads will fray and break. So there's a problem that I used to have originally when I started leatherworking with some really cheap thread, is that it wasn't waxed and I didn't inset it correctly, and it ended up kind of working against me a bit. So we have what's called a stitch groover. It can be a little bit finicky, but you line it up with the edge and you find your line and tighten it. And then by pushing down and pulling, you can groove that below the surface. It just takes off a small amount of the leather, just enough that the stitching can sit just below. A lot of people will argue and say that this isn't a necessary step. I don't think they're entirely wrong. I don't think it's fair to say that's incorrect, because a lot of stuff works without this kind of stitch grooving. But it's worth making sure if you're going to make something and you're going to sell something. I don't want people coming back to me saying, oh, it was lovely, but the stitching frayed and now I can't use it. Because we also glue these, but it's really the stitching that holds everything together. With the kind of glues that you get now for leather work, a lot of them are strong enough to hold the pieces by themselves without any issues whatsoever. Which is part of the reason why people say it's not necessary, because they will just glue it all together. But honestly, the stitching looks really nice, and it's kind of the main reason that I do this. So because the stitching goes all the way across this piece, you don't need to use the wing dividers, because this is already set to the right length, and I can just run it across a couple of times. There we go. Perfect. So that gets me my two pieces. And I'm just going to have to check the time. Okay, probably got another 5 minutes or so. So the next thing, I'm going to have a quick look at how this all fits together. So once it's all flattened out, that looks like it's going to be perfect. So the next step is quite a long process because it requires gluing. So I'm not going to do that on camera. I'm probably going to mark off my areas for gluing, and then I'm going to leave you guys there, because with the way the glue works, it's a contact cement, so you need to set it, leave it for 15 minutes where nothing really happens, and then come back and glue it later. So what I may do is finish this another lunchtime so you guys can still kind of follow along. But thank you to people that popped in, and I will see you next time.